Section 10 ay napag-usapan na natin, the non-impairment clause. No? Non-impairment clause simply says that no law impairing the obligation of contract shall be passed. Okay. So in Rutter versus Esteban, this is a case involving a moratorium law. Dito, dahil moratorium law, ang sabi ng batas, no? Katatapos lang kasi ng gera, no? Excuse me. Sorry. For purposes of my crazy recording, I will stop muna there. So this will be trimmed in another recording. So I will repeat that again. My God, I hate this. Okay. So for purposes of my recording, allow me to repeat that. Section 10 says no law impairing the obligation of contract shall be passed. Okay? This is the popularly known as the non-impairment clause. As you have learned in obligations and contract class, di ba? Contract is the law between the parties. So if you freely enter into a contract, you create a law with you and the other contracting party. In the law, no, must respect that. That is why there is this non-impairment clause. As a general rule, okay, the law cannot impair the obligations of contracts. Okay. Now, in the case of Rutter versus Esteban, okay, in the case Rutter versus Esteban, this is a moratorium law. After World War II, there was a moratorium law. We were still a neo-colony noon of the United States, under the United States. So it was the Governor General who issued an executive order and said, okay, we are still recovering from the damage created by the war. So during this interim period, lahat ng bawal muna maningil ng utang. Moratorium law. Okay? May moratorium sa paniningil ng utang para makarecover muna lahat ng tao. Okay. 4 years later, the Congress natin, the Commonwealth Congress, passed a law extending the moratorium law for another 8 years. Okay? So, this case was filed dahil sabi niya, the moratorium law violates the non-impairment clause. Because the moratorium law impairs the obligation created by the contract. Hindi kami makasingil eh. Okay? But the Supreme Court said, please take note, the Supreme Court said, moratorium laws do not impair obligations. Moratorium laws impair only the remedy. Obligation remains. Sa madaling salita, hindi naman sinabi ng batas na wala ka ng utang eh. Ang sabi lang naman ng batas, bawal ka muna maningil. So the obligation has not been impaired. It's still there. Okay? Remedy lang ang tinanggal. Ngunit, subalit, tatapot gayon pa man. When the period of the moratorium is unreasonably long, it already amounts to an impairment of the contract, of the obligation. So the court said, as a general rule, moratorium laws only impair the remedy, but when it is unreasonably long, it becomes an impairment of the obligation itself. And so the extension of the moratorium law was struck down as unconstitutional for being unreasonable. In Villanueva versus Castañeda, this involves vendors, no, who were using an idle government land. Okay? Idle government land, ginagamit nila. So nakita ng gobyerno, eventually, sinisingil na sila, nagbabayad na sila monthly. However, subsequently, the local sanggunian came up with an ordinance saying, okay, we will use that land, so kailangan ng paalisin yung mga vendors na nagagawa ng talipapa dyan. Okay. So paalisin na sila. So sabi nila, the ordinance, okay, is unconstitutional because it is a law that impairs an obligation. What obligation? Sabi niya, Although nung simula, wala kaming kontrata for using government land. Nung siningil nyo na kami monthly, an implied lease contract was created. Therefore, there is now an implied obligation created by contract. And the ordinance impairs that obligation. Okay? Galing, di ba? Ganda. Okay. Tama ba sila? Sabi ng Supreme Court. Una-una, wala namang implied contract. Pero even assuming for argument's sake that there is an implied lease contract, sabi ng Supreme Court, the non-impairment clause can never be raised as a deterrent to police power. Okay? Although it is a right under the Bill of Rights, it is inferior to police power. And so when the ordinance was passed as an exercise of police power, then the non-impairment clause cannot be used to stop it. Because the non-impairment clause is not a deterrent to the exercise of police power. Similarly, in the last two cases, class, the last two cases, Sanggalang and Ortigas, they both involve zoning ordinances ng local government unit. Kung familiar kayo, class, in mga LGU nagkla-classify yan, commercial, residential, industrial. Sa probinsya may agricultural pa. Okay? Zoning. In other words, dito yung commercial area, dito yung industrial, dito yung agricultural, dito yung residential. Supreme Court has consistently held zoning ordinances are manifestations or exercise of police power. Police power, yan. Okay. So in these two cases, class, nag-clash yung zoning ordinance with a private contract. Okay. In case hindi nyo rin alam, class, pag bumibili kayo sa mga private developer, let's say Forbes Park, San Lorenzo Village, Green Hills, okay, or any subdivision, any, or condominium for that matter. Pag bumibili kayo sa mga yan, laging merong tinatawag na deed of restrictions. Yung deed of restrictions na yan, naka-annotate yan in your title. And that serves as a contract between you and the developer that binds you. Kahit hindi ka original buyer, binili mo yung from another buyer, pagpunta sa'yo, naka-attach yun sa title eh. So bound ka rin by the deed of restrictions. Okay? So, in these two cases, may deed of restrictions. Yung sa Sanggalang, involving Bel Air Village in Makati, an exclusive subdivision. In Ortigas and Company versus CA, this involves Green Hill Subdivision, another exclusive subdivision. In both, malamang in your own villages may ganun din. May deed of restriction. At nakalagay doon, malamang, tignan niyo yung titulo ninyo kung hindi niyo alam. Nakalagay doon, must be used strictly for residential purposes only. So, the buyer of the subdivision lot is bound by that deed of restriction. It is a contract. Okay? Therefore, the law between the parties. Pero, in these two cases, class, in Sanggalang, Makati passed an ordinance and reclassified Jupiter. Alam niyo ba yung Jupiter sa Makati? If you are familiar with Jupiter in Makati, it is now a highly commercialized area, di ba? Di ba? Jupiter is a part of Bel Air. Okay. In the case of Ortigas naman, yung Green Hills Village, alam niyo ba yung Green Hills Village? The one adjacent to Ortigas Avenue. Yung Green Hills, kung kaliwa galing EDSA, Ortigas, di ba? Kanan Green Hills Subdivision yun eh. Yung nakadikit sa kalye ng Ortigas Avenue na Green Hills, purely residential din yun according to the deed of restrictions. But now, kung dumaan kayo doon, di ba, puro commercial area na yon. So, pareho tong cases na to. Deed of restriction, which is a contract between the buyer and the developer on the one hand, and a zoning ordinance on the other. In both cases, ang nangyari, in Makati, Jupiter was reclassified to commercial. In Green Hills, Ortigas was classified as commercial. Okay. So, ano nangyari? So, yung mga may-ari ng lote sa Jupiter, in-ignore na nila yung deed of restriction, pinarent na nila or binenta or nag-set up sila ng sariling commercial establishment. So, ang argument ng Bel Air in Sanggalang, which is the same argument na ginamit ng Ortigas in Ortigas. The ordinance impairs the obligations of a contract. Ang tanong sabi ng Supreme Court, oo, it does. It does. Doesn't make it unconstitutional. Okay? Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, the non-impairment clause cannot be used to be a deterrent to the exercise of police power. And as I already mentioned earlier, zoning ordinances, right? This is an exercise of police power. Okay? So, the police power will prevail over the non-impairment clause. So, in both cases, same ang decision. All right? Now, Section 11 is self-explanatory, so I do not have to explain that. Questions?